Hey guys, and welcome to another one of our audio-only podcast episodes here on Ghost Countries, where we dive into deeper detail on one of the countries we cover in one of our regular videos. As always, I'm joined by my co-host over in Germany, Manuel.
Hey guys.
And just a quick heads up here, if there's anything kind of funky with the audio, OBS has been really finicky lately. We've had to play around with a bunch of different filters and settings, so if there's any
Yeah, so
problems,
so
just
yeah, so if this video reaches 50,000 likes, we will improve the audio quality.
Yeah, no, exactly. But just bear with us if anything sounds a little tinny or weird. We've really tried multiple times to fix it, and I think it should be okay. But anyway, let's dive into it. So today we're going to be covering Western Togoland, and as we described in our video, this is a recent conflict in some ways, but it does have a long history. Maybe I should say issue instead of conflict, but it dates back to the plebiscite, which occurred in the 1950s, on whether that territory should remain as a UN trustee or be, you know, absorbed within the Gold Coast, which later became Ghana. Um, as we talked about, there's a whole bunch of divides and interpretations of this history, and it does go back even further than that to when Germany was the third largest colonial empire in Africa. But before getting into that, what are your thoughts on the, Western Togoland situation, Manuel?
I mean, the situation for Western Togoland itself is, I think, a very difficult one, because I don't see. I don't see a future for Western Togoland where they can really declare their independence, let's say, at least internationally recognized, at
Hmm.
least not in the near future, because it's difficult. I mean, we had, for example, that referendum,
Hmm.
um, but especially in areas which are, let's say, especially the north, um, like not densely populated,
Sure.
sparsely populated, it's difficult to create an infrastructure which you can really trust and you can hold accountable for
Hmm.
what's going on. Because uh, yeah, I just imagine it difficult even to say what does the majority think. Um,
Well, and that.
and
Oh, go on. Sorry.
yeah, so like, and until we don't have a clear situation there, I think there are just very few countries who would support, let's say, an independence movement if they are not sure
Well, I,
what the opinion is there.
I completely agree with you. I think the path for an independent Western Togoland is a very difficult one. It's definitely an uphill climb. But I do think what you mentioned about trust and being able to verify things is that actually gets to the root of the issue behind a lot of the secessionist claims over the 1956 British Togoland, the plebiscite. Now, like I said, that was to some degree monitored by the UN and Britain, and the results did show that somewhere in the range of about 58% voted for integration with, like I said, soon to be Ghana, while around 42% wanted to continue with UN trusteeship. So, I, well, so the big issue with this is you have a lot of groups that are advocating for autonomy or straight up secession, saying that the plebiscite was not legitimate. How the questions were worded, there was coercion. It was not representative of, the whole of Western Togoland or what was then British Togoland. But it goes down to, as you boil it down, we get to, this part of Ghana was at one point part of the German protectorate of Togoland. And within that protectorate, you had the Ewe, a ethnic group which now is kind of split between the country of Togoland and what is now eastern Ghana. So it's interesting to see, like, I mean, obviously there are some legal questions here which form part of the argument for the secessionist groups, but it goes beyond that. It goes to a broader colonial history, and at least if we're looking into this, I think it would be worth talking about the German colonial empire in Africa and their legacy before going into some more modern after effects of colonialism.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. So yeah, we will just recap this a second for those who are not totally familiar with that. So I mean, we had the colonial empires, which the most famous ones were, I guess, Spain in South America, especially, and Central America, Portugal, a little around the world,
Yeah,
and of course, then in Africa, especially, um, the Great Britain and France.
definitely.
That Germany had a colonial empire is, I think, very often overseen, at least from what I see.
Oh, totally,
Um,
because not to cut in, but just saying it was like it popped up in the late 1800s more or less and was gone by World War One.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's exactly the reason why many people, yeah, don't really know it. Um, and I mean, in Africa, I think there were four colonies. I think
Yep, there were four.
with
There was
now like
Togoland,
Togo. No,
Cameroon.
I wanted to say Nevada, but
Uh,
it's it's not Nevada. It's Namibia.
yeah, you had
Um,
Togoland, Cameroon, what is now Namibia, which was German Southwest Africa, and then German East Africa, which was primarily
Tanzania.
Tanzania, but also included, other parts of like Rwanda and Burundi.
Yeah. So, like for example, if I think back, I mean, I'm a German, so in my school history classes, I think there was not a huge topic.
Hmm.
I mean, German history itself was actually not a huge topic, which was covered. Basically, we did Bismarck
Hmm.
very much, and then basically First World War, and the time after that was very um, largely discussed. Let's say like the Republic of Weimar and the Nazis and stuff. That was really a huge part of German history, at least in our classes.
And
But the colonial empire was not largely discussed.
no, and that's interesting. But actually, I'm glad you brought up Bismarck because I find it fascinating that Bismarck did not want a colonial empire. Now, like as I stated in the video, it's not like he was morally opposed to the idea of colonialism, but he just saw this as Germany overextending itself. I mean, Germany had really just become a united entity, relatively recently at that period of time. And he felt that by thrusting themselves into the colonial game, you were going to make some powerful enemies. I mean, you got France, you've got the United Kingdom. Like you mentioned, there were other players as well, Portugal, Spain, etc. But he felt this was not the best move at the time because it overextended Germany. It put Germany in a precarious position and it could have threatened the viability of the German state back in Europe. And I find that really fascinating because it wasn't per se Bismarck who was advocating for this colonial venture, but rather it was a whole bunch of pro colonial societies back in Germany, along with the traders and other people throughout the world, German traders. And of course, you also had the Kaiser, who was a proponent of this. And I know he and Bismarck clashed pretty strongly over this in time. But before getting into that, yeah, no, it's kind of fascinating because Germany at that period of time had traders and little trading outposts all over the world. You had stuff over in Fiji, you had things in Senegal, different parts of Africa, um, you know, East Asia, so China, and in time at least. And increasingly, these groups felt threatened that without actual governmental backing from Germany, that they were kind of, subject to the whims of other colonial powers. And that's exactly what happened in Fiji. The German traders out there eventually kind of got, the boot when the British came in. And there were fears that similar things could go on in other parts of the world. Basically, the British or the French or someone else would come in and say, okay, guys, you're out. So there were people who were looking at this from like a security standpoint. They wanted the security and backing of Germany, even though the big figurehead over in Germany was kind of like, well, I get that, but this is not this has political risk back in Europe.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I mean, at that time, let's say later on, we got the situation that actually Germany was, yeah, more or less didn't care
Hmm.
that other countries are going to be like, let's say that there could be a potential conflict there. But like, for example, for the colonial empire, there's actually even a very famous sentence which was said by Bernhard von Bülow, which was, yeah, a politician in the parliament
Hmm.
at that time, and he said, um, I mean, in German, it is like we don't want to put anybody
Ah,
into
yeah,
our shadow, but we demand our place at the sun.
exactly. I
Uh,
remember that one, and I also remember. I don't remember the German phrase, but maybe you could help me out here. It was the fear I was talking about, that fear of missing out, or well, missing out, basically FOMO, was
uh,
gate shut panic.
yeah, Torschlusspanik. Yeah,
There we go.
exactly.
And it was this fear, like you said, that they were going to. Well, first off, it was the fear other powers were going to kick them out. But then it was also coupled with this fear, like, if we don't move, we're not going to get anything. We gotta jump on this now, or there's going to be nothing left, and we'll just picking up the scraps, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And that was exactly the mood in the parliament, let's say, at that time.
Hmm.
For example, that quote, what I just said, was in '97, so
Hmm.
it's actually pretty late.
Yeah.
If you take into consideration like France and Great Britain when they founded their colonial empires.
Oh no, exactly. And that's what I find fascinating about the German colonial empire, that it started so late. I mean, it was really, like we said, the late 1800s.
It was
And,
basically it started and it was gone.
well, no, exactly. It was very short lived, but it also became very big very quick. I mean, they had the third largest colonial empire in Africa. And as we did kind of mention, they also did have colonial holdings out in Asia. You had those various ports in China, and you also had, the northeastern half of what is now Papua New Guinea. You had various islands throughout Oceania. So you had a rather large international colonial empire that popped up in a pretty short period of time.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's fascinating, and for me, it's always like funny, like how quick it actually formed itself and how quick it was actually gone again. Um, and yeah, so as you already mentioned, Bismarck was, for example, totally against that.
Hmm.
I mean, because of the situation Germany was in. Germany was like founded in 71,
Hmm.
1871, for those who didn't know it. So until that quote that we had here, it was past 27 years. There's not a long time. I mean, speaking of a country.
Oh no, it was a
Um,
newly formed state in a lot of ways.
yeah, exactly. Um, yeah. So, but here we had that situation. I mean, which was one of the reasons for all those conflicts which we had, for example, as well in Western Togoland, was basically the colonial legacy of the Western powers
Hmm.
in Africa. And that is, for example, the borders which were
Hmm.
created, which were not as, like, let's say, in most European countries, or let's say in most countries in general, you have natural borders like rivers or, yeah, mountains or, well, the ocean or whatever. um, but in Africa, it was very often the case that it was just hand drawn a line where they said, okay, this is the border. I mean, you even have other borders, but you had this situation very often in Africa that you just had a line written there and it said, this is, yeah, this is the border now. So, of course, there are a lot of problems which you create by this. Would you like to explain what the problems are if you do a border like this?
Well, sure. And actually, I want to, staying with the German colonial empire for a moment, I think a classic example of that is the Caprivi Strip in what was then German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, you kind of might look at the country nowadays and be like, okay, it kind of looks, like the borders make sense, but then why is there this random like strip, for lack of a better word, that just stretches out from the country's like north into the east? And that geographic salient protruding from Nambia was added for no other reason except the colonial powers at the time, Germany, wanted access to the Zambezi River for trade. And that's it. That's basically it. They wanted to have some outpost on this river and others for trade. And a huge chunk of the Caprivi Strip is not really habitable territory for people. It's a beautiful area from what I understand, but it was really just tacked on to the colonial holding simply for access for the rivers, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense in terms of the history of the people in that region, or their culture, their linguistic groups. There's no basis for it, really no basis for it, except for what I said. It's they wanted access to the river, and that's just one example. You can look through, and that's an example pertaining to Germany, but you can look at examples throughout Africa in that regard. I mean, Sudan is a pretty good example of this, or you could argue Nigeria as well. But sticking with Sudan for a moment, the North and the South were and are very distinct from each other. You basically have the Sahel, which is it's commonly thought of as like the divider between northern Islamic Africa and sub-Saharan uh, Christian or animist Africa. And it more or less goes right through the middle of, Sudan and many other countries as well. And the North and the South were very distinct from each other. They didn't really see each other as a unified people. And in fact, if you look at their histories, there's a lot of clashes and friction between the two groups, but that didn't really matter, and they were lumped together into what eventually became the country of Sudan. And as we do know, those pre-existing and ongoing tensions and differences eventually resulted in a very violent conflict in that country, which ultimately resulted in the split up, and we had, South Sudan become an independent country in 2011. So it's interesting to see how those colonial borders, which were drawn more or less with no regard for the existing, histories, ethnic, linguistic, tribal, cultural, religious makeup of the people in the region. That was all an afterthought, if even an afterthought, for the colonial powers that be at the time. It was just drawn with no consideration of that, and you had people get divided, you had people be lumped together who were very different from each other, and yeah, it really created something of a mess in terms of the borders and how it divided or grouped together people on the continent.
Yeah, that's definitely true. You see still nowadays. You already mentioned that in a sentence, and that is, for example, as well, the religion
Hmm.
um, plays a big role as well in many conflicts in Africa. Um,
among
I think,
among other factors, I mean ethnicity,
yeah, sure,
linguistics, etc.
yeah, yeah, that's for sure. Like the two largest religion, at least to my knowledge, are yeah the Christians and Muslims,
Hmm.
and yeah they, let's say in Africa, in a lot of areas, unfortunately, there are very big conflicts between those two groups, and of course these are issues as well with the border drawing and stuff,
Sure.
which intensified that whole situation as well. And we and for example as well linguistic problems.
Yeah.
Um, one very good example would be, for example, Ambazonia.
Hmm.
In Ambazonia, you have basically, I mean, Ambazonia is a part of Cameroon nowadays,
Yes.
um, and the largest part of the population there is, how do I say it in English? Francophone,
Yeah,
right?
francophone, so French speaking, the
Yeah,
majority of Cameroon is, at least anyway.
yeah. So you got a conflict there between the Francophone and the Anglophone population, and it's actually something which is not largely discussed in, at least in Germany. Um, like I just found it by accident actually, or let's say it actually Ghost found it by accident and showed it to me. um, it is, yeah, a very, actually a pretty big conflict with 3 to 4 million people impacted by it, and yeah, maybe you can tell us some more about that conflict there.
Well, it's basically what you were saying. I mean, Cameroon is it's a rather interesting looking country. I mean, it stretches all the way up to, Lake Chad in the north, and then you've got the majority of the country down in the southern half. But like you said, the country is divided between the francophone or French speaking people and the anglophone or English speaking people, which are more or less clumped in like the, western portion of the country. And yeah, there has been an ongoing conflict between the two groups uh, since the country's independence, more or less, uh, in a very similar way or fashion to Western Togoland. There's well, there was, a plebiscite, and there's groups in what is now, or what they're referring to as Ambazonia, that argue that they should have been granted independence, and they didn't want to be incorporated into, the francophone portion of Cameroon. And the issue, it's not just with the plebiscite and everything, but that it does have some basis in that. And of course, now as we move into the modern era, there's claims that, English is being erased and they're being marginalized. And because of that, yeah, it's an ongoing crisis, and it's a pretty violent crisis as well. There's been a number of deaths, IED attacks, raids on from both sides. It's a serious and ongoing situation.
Yeah, definitely, and very overlooked. What
Oh,
I, at least in my opinion.
oh, definitely,
Um,
definitely. But by no means is it the only country to have a secessionist group like this. I mean, I can think in neighboring Nigeria, you had Biafra. Like we've already mentioned Western Togoland, but there are so many other groups like this throughout Africa and of course throughout the world. But if we're just looking at Africa right now, I mean, Ethiopia is another good example of this. You've got, uh, perhaps somewhat timely here, you've got the ongoing situation in Tigray. So there's groups there advocating for independence. You've got the Ormoro, you've got Ogaden, the Somali region. So basically, like you said, all these factors come into play. You've got religion, you've got tribal or ethnic, you've got linguistic, and there's just so many divisions from the colonial borders in country, and even countries that weren't touched by colonialism as much, Ethiopia being an example. You still have these issues at play.
yeah, like I was right now thinking about the situation actually in Somalia.
Hmm.
I'm not totally familiar. I know that Somalia has a problem with, yeah, well, well, state control. Let's say
Or lack
basically
thereof.
what?
Or lack thereof. I mean, yeah, it's
Yeah, yeah,
been.
that's exactly what I mean. Yeah. Um, but I don't know if there are actually groups who claim or who want to claim independence from Somalia.
Oh, well,
Um,
I think the biggest one, just putting this out there, is Somaliland, which is the northeastern.
sure. Like, that was really silly. Okay, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, the northeastern portion, and that used to be the British protectorate of Somaliland. So again, it kind of does break down along those colonial borders, but it's not just that. I mean, there are other factors. I don't want to oversimplify any of these conflicts, be it Ambazonia or Somaliland, and say it's only because of colonialism. No, there's a whole bunch of other factors contributing to these crises. Maybe that's not the correct word, but anyway, there's a whole bunch of other factors here. But yeah, Somalia's got breakaway regions as well. Like I said, you've got Somaliland. You kind of did have some agitation from Puntland. Puntland, I may have pronounced that incorrectly, but that's the like northern tip, northeastern tip of Somalia. Um, I don't know if I said northeastern for Somaliland. That's northwestern. But either way, yeah, you've definitely got secessionist movements all over Africa for one reason or another, and it's in part that legacy of colonialism and the borders definitely does play a role in that.
Yeah, that's completely correct. And what you said before is like when you mentioned that is not the only thing. I mean, not the I mean the colonial past, not the only reason for what's happening there. That's true. And but it's like as always, like all things in history, it comes down to more than one reason.
Sure.
When big things are happening, and yeah, so this whole border crisis actually like it's a complicated situation that these borders were actually drawn, and then like later on they became independent, but the problem is the old borders are very often still in place,
Hmm.
and that's creating actually a big issue which is hard to resolve because how do you want to solve a problem like this? I mean, the only way would be like countries giving up their borders and creating new ones, but of course that is a potential loss in power for many countries, and yeah, or resources as well. And of course, nobody wants this, or let's say very few countries, I'd say, would be ready to do something like that. So yeah, these whole border drawings there, this created a big problem, which is still lasting to nowadays. And I don't know how to solve this problem during the next years, but yeah,
I
time
don't
will
think
show
anyone
us
really
probably.
does. That's a very complicated question.
Yeah, it definitely is. Um, yeah, so before you already talked about Sudan
Hmm.
and South Sudan. Coming back to that point, I can still remember that, yeah, very vividly. In German TV, there was like the advertisement, and basically the main factor for, let's say, I mean, like for example, for donating money and stuff. Basically, when they were talking about humanitarian crisis, it was basically at that time always South Sudan, and they were always showing pictures from South Sudan, and yeah, like these kind of conflicts there. These, I mean, like for us, they are not that common. Let's say, I mean, they are existing as well. For example, we had Northern Ireland,
Hmm.
similar conflict, but that it comes along with starvation and a real open war um, is, I think, for most industrialized countries something with which is hard to imagine nowadays.
Well, and
So it's like, yeah, really interesting actually, and horrible.
no, and just picking up on that note, I mean, if we're talking about South Sudan, yeah, that country had the rather unfortunate reality that just, a few years after it gained independence in January 2011, it was embroiled in a very long and extremely destructive civil war, as you mentioned, from 2013 to 2020, or 2020, what did I say there? um, so yeah, and that devastated the country. It more or less, though not entirely, fell along political and ethnic slash tribal lines. It became a humanitarian catastrophe, like you mentioned, famine, disease. It was just catastrophic for the newfound country at the time. And I do also want to take note that South Sudan is not the only country that kind of chafes at the colonial borders that were established for Sudan. I mean, you do have some agitating for independence in Darfur, and as we know, there had been a very violent conflict at you know in the not too distant past that occurred in that region. You also do have ongoing conflicts in South Kordofan and the Blue Nile region. So
And we even got another ghost country which had a border issue in Africa too, but we won't spoil which one it is.
oh, believe me, we've got a lot of ghost countries because of these colonial borders, which will be very interesting to cover in the future. But you can definitely see how uh, the legacy of colonialism, even though it is gone, is not gone in another sense. I think actually another ghost country that we probably will cover, we don't have anything in works right now, but I would be fascinated to do this, would be Azawad, which is the Tuareg, uh, well, a self proclaimed Tuareg majority state that popped up in northern Mali for a period of time. As I'm sure some people do remember, there was a pretty violent conflict in Mali, which occurred in like 2012, 2013. And the Tuareg people, who are distinct from other people within Mali, um, they tried under the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, MNLA, get my acronym right. They tried to set up their own state, and for a period of time it did seem to be working, but then you had this odd, uh, more or less a takeover by various Islamist groups in the movement. Now, there's arguments about how much they may have been associated with the MNLA, and yeah, it more or less imploded upon itself, and now it's deteriorated into this rather serious and still ongoing situation in the Sahara and the Sahel, where you have various terrorist groups that are active in Mali, Niger, uh, Algeria, and other Burkina Faso, uh, Nigeria, Chad. It's become a rather serious situation, and it spilled out. It spilled outward, and actually, the whole reason that conflict even began, or the impetus, the spark, so to speak, was at least in part, the collapse of the dictatorship over in Libya, and you had just a spillover of all these Tuareg fighters coming from Libya into Mali. It's really interesting to see these dynamics at play, but colonialism and those borders definitely still play a role. It's a factor you have to consider.
Oh, and I think a lot of people would be interested in something like that
Definitely, definitely.
because the Touareg are as well very famous. I mean, Volkswagen even called a car Touareg.
Yeah, that's true. I remember that. Which brand was that? I forgot who called it Touareg.
Volkswagen.
Oh, Volkswagen. Okay, there we go. But yeah, no. So that would be a fascinating ghost country that I think more or less, I think we can commit to that. We will cover that in the not too distant future. But it's just one of many. There's countless separatist movements throughout Africa, and of course, this isn't only an African uh, related phenomena. You can see it in Europe, you can see it in Asia, you can see it in the Americas. Yeah, so it's not just like this is something that is unique to Africa, but there's plenty of countries that we can cover. And of course, if anyone has, I don't know, a particular ghost country or separatist movement they want covered, feel free to let us know in the comments because more than willing, as long as we can find material on it, more than willing to.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, we always try to keep our eyes open for new ghost countries or those ones that we remember. But of course, the more brains you have, the better it is.
We do have a big
So
list,
maybe,
though. We do have a pretty
yeah,
big
yeah.
list.
I think we have an endless list because you can basically, yeah, create a lot of countries, or I mean, talk about a lot of countries. But like, especially like if you are like, let's say, in a country or in a region in general where actually there is something like a ghost countries, feel free to write us. I mean, some are maybe that special that without checking it out we wouldn't know. So yeah, please let us know if you have any suggestions.
No, definitely, definitely. And okay, so taking a bit of a step back from the big picture we've been looking at here. I mean, we've touched on the German colonial empire, and honestly, that's probably something we'll cover. I mean, I said this in the video itself, but I do think that's something we should cover, in an episode in sometime in the future because yeah, it's not a country per se, it's a colonial empire, but in a way it is its own, entity, and I think that would be fascinating to cover. Might even be a multi-part series because like the history of each of those colonial entities, whether it be Togoland, Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, German East Africa, they've got unique and very compelling stories to tell. Now I feel like I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I mean, you had major colonial uprisings in, again, what is now Namibia and what is Tanzania. And these played a very, obviously from a humanitarian, well, I was going to say these played interesting roles in the history of Germany because they definitely, well, they were unique periods of history. I don't know what I'm trying to go on. But you had like the Herero-Nama Wars in 1904, and the, I might be pronouncing this wrong, but the Maji-Maji Rebellion in German East Africa in 1905. And, you know, these are stories that I think deserve to be told, and I think for a lot of people are not things that are, well, you know, they kind of go, it's an overlooked chapter of history, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I agree. Like yeah, you got just in the German colonial empire so many options actually. Um, I mean, those in Africa are actually just those ones which are famous. I think that that one in Papua New Guinea,
Hmm.
New Guinea, it's called right,
Yep.
in English. I think that is even less known. So
Oh,
yeah, it's
sure.
definitely an option for future projects.
Well, sure, and it's interesting to see how those territories were, at least in part, taken by, you know, Japan after World War One, and we're going down a rabbit hole here, but the long and short is, I do think we're going to have an episode covering the German colonial empire. Might even be a multi-part series, and I'm sure we'll do the same with other colonial empires and just empires in history, because some of these are too big to fit into one episode.
Yeah, it's always interesting in history. Basically, always when you think, okay, right now I'll read this, then I know a little more. And actually, the more you read into things, the more you realize you have no idea about history.
Hmm. Yeah, no,
That's at
I'd
least
agree.
my feeling. Like the more you read, the more you realize you know nothing.
No, exactly. And I think you'll kind of see that with one of our we've got a few mini series coming out, and the thing is, these mini series were supposed to be mini, and they still are relative to our regular videos, but the more you dig into it, the more you find out, and it just, you know, it keeps going.
Yeah,
Keeps going.
maybe for our audience, maybe it would be good to know that we are both historians, so we already got some knowledge about history. I didn't want that that the previous comment sounds like we have no idea what we're talking about.
No, exactly. But to the point I was trying to say before I went down this like rabbit hole, like I said, taking a step back and looking at Western Togoland itself, what are your honest opinions about its future? Like, I see the conflict ongoing, and it is ongoing. I mean, we've had somewhat recent arrests of accused separatists. We've had some appear in court. We've had attacks that have resulted in, you know, deaths and or injuries. So this is still, this is not an issue that is resolved, and I think it's going to continue to, well, continue. But uh, I just don't really see an independent Western Togoland popping up on the map anytime soon. Now, to be fair, I want to put this on record, as we did say in the video. You know, Western Togoland is a member state of the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization since 2017. So it does have a degree of international standing, I guess you could say, at least within that body. It is a country that does, or no, I shouldn't say a country, but a region that does have, you know, a degree of resources, coastline, depending on how the borders are drawn exactly. And if you consider it relative to other former British colonies such as Malta, Gambia, and some, you know, Caribbean countries, it's, you know, in terms of landmass, larger than those. So there are those who argue, you know, it could be a viable state. I just don't see a situation arising in which it's going to break away from Ghana, because I just don't see that happening. When I look at the security situation, when I look at the political situation, even within Western Togoland, I mean, I see enough to keep it an ongoing issue. I just don't see enough to make it a, you know, full-fledged breakaway state.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I mean, I said it already when we were starting the podcast.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I don't see a real future, at least in the near future, for Western Togoland. I mean, I said unfortunately, but I mean, you know what I mean. Like, I cannot say if who's right in this
Yeah,
situation
we're
because
we're not picking
very few
sides here.
people
We're
can.
just presenting the historical situation as best we can with
Yeah,
context.
exactly. So yeah, I don't see the a situation where you could have like a kind of independence or anything. At least not in the near future. I mean, but I mean, time is gonna show. Um, I mean, there could happen things which change the impact of things completely. Like we see that in very many cases where just something happens and then the whole situation is different. But we don't know. I see it very similar to you. I don't see it coming. But I gotta say one thing: Western Togoland, at least for one thing, is gonna stay in my heart, and that is the flag. Because I do think the flag actually looks looks decent. I mean, like it's a creative design.
Yeah, no,
For
I
those,
will fully agree. Not to cut you off, but just saying visually, it is a very well designed flag.
yeah. So like for those people who don't know it, it's basically in the center there are two hands shaking, but in the shape of a heart, and it doesn't look weird. It looks organic actually, um, at least in my eyes. So I think the flag design was very good. So they must have had a good designer or some good ideas there.
And in all fairness, this isn't the Oling flag that we've seen associated with Western Togoland or some of the secessionist movements, but this is kind of like the de facto Western Togoland flag. And I do agree with you. Like I said, visually, it's a well designed flag. It's got a minimalist vibe to it, but at the same time, it's nice. It's a nice flag.
Yeah, and definitely something different to the flags that we are mostly used to.
No, exactly. But picking up on the point you said, yeah, this is a fluid situation. We have no idea how things may change in the near future. I don't think many people were expecting events in 2020 to, pick up as they did with Western Togoland, and that kind of came out of the blue in some ways. So you never know. It's in flux. Things can change. But at least from my, and it sounds like your assessment as well. It's like very unlikely we're going to see Western Togoland pop up on the map anytime soon. And I think in the same vein, it's probably pretty unlikely the UN is going to look into the matter. But then again, I mean, we've got so much going on from last year and into 2021. But so, we're dating this video by me putting that there. But who knows? Like, if in the future I'm completely wrong on this, okay, call out past me. But I don't know.
Yeah, like if this podcast comes out and then the next day you got the declaration of independence of Western Togoland, okay, then we were wrong.
Or at least the UN looking into the matter. I mean, it could happen. I just don't think it is right now. But who knows? Medium to short or medium to long term, situation can change. So I guess we'll just kind of have to wait and see. But yeah, no, nonetheless, a very interesting, though definitely overlooked. You know,
That's our catchphrase.
yeah, yeah, it seems to be interesting but overlooked, and that's definitely what Western Togoland is, at least from outside, that specific like Ghana or that specific region of Africa. I don't think many people are very aware of the rebellion and the ongoing crisis. And hopefully we shed some light on it. Hopefully we got you guys interested in maybe some of the other uh, ghost countries in Africa. And of course, like we've said multiple times, if you have any suggestions for other countries, be they, from far in the past or right here in the present, let us know. And, as long as we can find material on it, we'll probably do an episode on it sometime in the future.
Yeah, exactly. So I have nothing to add here. I think, yeah, I totally agree with you said. Um, yeah, so I think we can wrap this up here.
Yeah, no, I'd agree.
I hope you liked the episode. If you did, you can share it, like it. I mean, interaction is always good for us. But we
Subscribe.
really appreciate our followers who are already commenting and liking and giving suggestions. So, as we already said, thank you very much. And then I'd say see you next time.
Yeah, no, definitely. See you guys next time. Feel free to share the channel, subscribe, and I think that's about it.